All right, welcome. This came so quickly, and we're so glad that we have such great interest in the workshop we're going to be presenting today. I'm Elizabeth Betancourt. I'm the Natural and Working Lands Policy Advisor for the Department of Conservation and the executive sponsor for the Department of Conservation's Forest Biofuels Program. This workshop today, Feedstock Development Planning, came about because of some conversations that we had amongst our interagency team, federal and state agencies, in developing the Forest Biofuels Program solicitation last year, as well as some of what we heard from applicants to that program and awardees. It became really clear that there was something of a gap in knowledge and maybe a gap in understanding in, and have to say truly a need in getting feedstock to the biomass fuel sector specifically, that being such a new industry for our state. So we started thinking about how to address that gap, and thinking about templates or how can we get the information out. And in a conversation that I had with Tad several months ago, he said, well, what about a workshop? And I am so grateful for that conversation, and grateful to Tad for participating today, as well as all of our presenters, to make it possible to address some of the challenges associated with feedstock procurement in California. Just a note, reminder, we will be recording this and we will make it available on our program webpage when the recording is ready. I think it's usually on YouTube with a link on our program webpage. And actually, Nicole, if you wouldn't mind putting a link to the Forest Biofuels Program into the chat, that would be awesome if people want to know a little bit more about that. So also, just as a little bit more background, we are obviously state and federal agencies represented on the call today, as well as the private sector folks, are vested in making sure that our woody biomass businesses can succeed in California. Variety of reasons, of course, with forest health and rural economic growth and sustainability, wildfire risk mitigation, certainly, climate resilience, a whole lot of reasons to make sure that this industry can make it here in our state. So I think we have a really great panel of conversations to get us at least started on that topic this afternoon. I know there will be more to discuss as we move forward. So to kick us off, we are going to hear from Deputy Chief John McCarthy, who oversees the state's Business and Workforce Development's grant program. They also, conveniently for this topic, have some transportation subsidy funding available this year. He has a long history in forest management in California from a variety of perspectives. We are super lucky to have him on the state side now as a wonderful colleague. And he's going to give you an overview of the importance of doing this work today. So John, if you need me to do anything on my end, please let me know, but you should be able to share screen.
Yeah, let me see if it works.
Awesome.
Okay, what do people see a slideshow and no notes?
Yes.
Great.
Thank you.
All right, thanks everybody. Thanks, Elizabeth. So I'm John McCarthy. I am a forester with CAL FIRE. I'm in our wood products and bioenergy team. I'm here today to talk about the state's goal of treating 1 million acres a year, and what is that priority for us, and why, and how that's going to generate feedstock. We're gonna treat 1 million acres a year through prescribed fire, through mastication, and mechanical thinning. The mechanical thinning activities are going to generate biomass, and we need to do something with that. So I'll be presenting 9 slides. I'll start with a background on our wood products and bioenergy team. I always like to talk about our team. We are running a grant program. We've awarded about $60 million in the last year and a half, 2 years. Then I'll be talking about traditional wood products and kind of new wood products, and a different kind of way to look at forest products. And maybe one of the challenges to feedstock is this transition we're doing from traditional wood products to what our new needs are, and then wrap up. So the wood products and bioenergy team is within the climate and energy program, which is in the resource management side of CAL FIRE. So resource management, we're the state's foresters and environmental scientists. The Climate and Energy Program addresses supporting healthy forests that sequester carbon. So our forest health grants, they provide money for large fuel reduction projects. And then we work, align with those kind of efforts in the Wood Products and Bioenergy team by trying to expand the infrastructure and workforce needed to treat 1 million acres a year. So to treat the bottlenecks of that pace and scale, we often call it, we're looking at answering questions like, where do we take the wood and the fuels? Who can do the work? And importantly, how do we build a long-term forest economy that does not depend on grants? So Wood Products and Bioenergy, you can Google us and find us quickly. You can read all about us. We're a little team. We're 3 foresters and a grants analyst. Our mission is to maintain and enhance the forestry sector infrastructure of California to support healthy, resilient forests along with the people and ecosystems that depend on them. So we have to date awarded 33 million in workforce development and 29 million in business development. We run a competitive grant program. Our goal is to encourage the development of new ideas to utilize forest waste, or part of our program addresses that. So I want to talk about kind of traditional logging. So this is what we used to do. We went to the woods because there was a demand for construction materials, boards, forest products, and there were 2x4s inside these trees. And if we felled, skidded, hauled, and cut away everything that wasn't a 2x4, we ended up with a product that was more valuable than all those costs that it took to make it. So that created a nice business. So these activities did result in residues. So the residues were needles, limbs, bark, rot, and mill residues. And all those wastes, all those residues were left in the woods or they were burned. And you can drive around California and see these called teepee burners at old mill sites. And it wasn't that long ago that mills were still putting all their mill residues in these and burning them. Then they couldn't do that anymore. So they had to find other uses. So a lot started doing cogeneration. So they were combusting it to create electricity, and they could and heat. They could run that heat back into their kilns to dry boards, and they could use the electricity to power their mill and sell some back to the grid. So it's important to think mills didn't go build cogen facilities because they wanted to get into the energy business. They just needed something to do with their waste. And then they became better at it over time. And they found there is a value to the products they can make with those wastes. So a lot of people have seen these kinds of images, historical timber stand on the left and what we currently have on the right. So the old stands, we talk about this all the time. Larger trees, large diameter, well spaced, open understory. These were, resilient to wildfire. Current stands, very dense, overstocked, too many trees, understory fuels, ladder fuels, fires become quite devastating. So our goal is to get back to these historical stands, wildfire resilient stands with low fuels. And to do that, we need to get into our stands and thin them out. So the state's committed to it, we call it the 1 million acre strategy. Some estimates, CARB recognize that we need to do even more than that. So doing these treatments is going to generate biomass. We're going to remove that from the woods, and we need to do something with it. So I want to present an idea though, that we're not, it's not presenting an idea, but kind of emphasize that we're not going out to the woods because these are valuable products that we want to remove. Maybe the product is the forest. So maybe forest products we have to think of as the forest. And what's the value of this to Californians? Water, clean air, wildfire resiliency, security, recreation, wildlife, all those kinds of things. If so, then all the material that we're pulling out of the forests, is a waste, which is not just these slash piles or coal decks, which are the traditional waste in the woods, but also the saw logs. So if the healthy forest is the product, then everything removed is waste. And we need facilities that can utilize that waste. Some of those facilities will be sawmills. If you can make a 2x4 out of our waste, that's great. But we can't make 2x4s out of all of them. So we need to be able to do something else. So we'll need a variety of manufacturing facilities that utilize all this forest waste. So maybe we think about the future forest product manufacturing facilities, think of them more as waste disposal sites than factories. And I like to do that. And why? And part of it is because we don't expect to pay waste disposal sites for our waste. We expect to pay a fee. And even though a facility can still make and be highly motivated to make products that have value, we may be paying fees and not being surprised by that, and working that into kind of how this market develops. So that's kind of my discussion of what the state's motivation of clearing forests and how it will result in material that can become feedstock for your facilities. I always like this table this BET group puts out. It presents about 40 different products that you can make out of forest biomass. It's everything from saw logs to nanocellulose and all sorts of things in between. That is my presentation. And I don't know if we're doing questions now or at the end, but however you want to do it, Elizabeth.
Thank you, John. I think we do actually have a minute or two for a question or two if folks have them. If you do have a question, I think I can see your hand raised in the participants chat. Feel free to raise your hand and I will invite you to unmute. I see. Martin, you should be able to unmute.
Hi, thank you. I have a couple of questions. First, from those 1 million acres that you plan to treat every year, how many tons are you expecting to take out of that?
Boy, that's been the question of the year. I think there's a lot of ways to look at it. I think we've kind of got to, nobody's upset or gets too bent if we say about 5 to 7 million bone dry tons per year. Would you say? I mean, some will say more, some will say less.
I think a nice cop out is that the regions are going to be able to do that in the next year or so. They're going to make estimates. And so we as a state don't have to put that on anyone. They're going to do it themselves, which is awesome.
It's a lot more than we have capacity to take currently, or current infrastructure.
And the second question is, do you intend to transport that material, or you expect someone to go and pick that up?
Well, that all depends on, there's a lot of ways to pay. I think it's going to be looking at it differently than we have traditionally, where the product in the woods was worth more than all the costs it took to get from there to the site to the lumberyard. So how it's paid for and who's benefiting and how to monetize, it's going to be, there's a lot of different ways to do it. It'll be depend on regions, it'll depend on what the feedstock is, but it's going to be paid in a lot of different ways.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, John. Thank you, Martin. I know that there are more questions, but if you all don't mind putting those into the chat or the Q&A, John, would you be so kind as to type out answers, and if any kind of rise to the surface that we need to address at the end, we'll have time then. Do you mind? Thanks.
Sounds good.
Appreciate you, John. All right, so we are going to move on to Tad. Tad Mason from TSS Consultants. He is CEO of TSS Consultants and a registered professional forester. He leads a team of professionals there at the consulting group who are well versed in the tasks required to successfully develop bioenergy projects. They assist clients with development and implementation of communication plans essential to the success of these projects. We know sometimes these can be a little controversial, so certainly appreciate help on that front. And much of Tad's work is in support of, and this is a tongue twister, optimized utilization of cellulosic byproducts generated during commercial land management and agricultural or forest project manufacturing activities. So we are really lucky to have Tad here today. Again, Tad, thank you so much for suggesting this workshop in concept and for joining us today and presenting your knowledge. Appreciate you. Feel free to take it away.
Okay, happy to be here. I have a short 16 slide deck to share. At the close, we'll field questions. Let's hope we can make this work smoothly. There we go. Elizabeth, is that first slide on the screen?
It looks great, Tad. Thank you.
Oh, good. Great. Okay. So just to continue on with the introduction of my background and experience, in the mid-1980s, when standalone biomass power plants began to be developed here in California, I was fortunate enough to be recruited into Pacific Energy, which is the renewable energy arm at the time of Sempra Energy, a large holding company. At any rate, we developed 4 wood-burning power plants, and once those plants were developed, I transitioned into the fuel procurement manager position. So from that experience, I'm able to provide some observations that you'll see here in a minute. But also in 2000, when I joined TSS, a lot of my work was focused on feedstock supply availability and cost assessments. And then sometimes once those reports were delivered, the clients would ask that I step in and actually set up a procurement plan and start putting together short-term and long-term contracts to secure feedstock into the facility. And the different types of technologies we've worked with include bioenergy, of course, renewable natural gas, synthetic diesel, sustainable aviation fuel, but also fuel pellets and composite panels. Think oriented strand board or medium density fiberboard or particle board. And then also small sawmills. We get involved with assisting small sawmills in their startup and production from time to time. So at any rate, let's get into the presentation. Basically, this is just an outline of what I'll be sharing with you today. That photograph on the right there is a innovative wood fiber transportation trial that we put together about 6 years ago on the Tahoe National Forest. On the left, though, is more importantly the outline of my presentation, and you can see we'll be focused on feedstocks, what a feedstock supply assessment looks like, the key components of feedstock procurement, agreements, and how we manage risk, and then a quick outline of what a procurement plan looks like. So feedstock characteristics, the reason this is important to consider is because depending on the technology that's being deployed, be it bioenergy or composite panels or fuel pellets, these feedstock characteristics are very important for the ultimate production of the value-added product. So we traditionally have a couple of filters that we look at: heating value, also known as high heating value, which is British thermal units per dry pound. That's typically the unit of measure. And then moisture content, think percent water. Sizing, the way that chippers and grinders that are deployed today in the West, typically those can be adjusted to produce a variety of sizing. For the power plants, it's typically 3" minus. Excuse me. For fuel pellet operations, it can be a microchip down to 1" minus. So there's a variety of sizing options out there. Ash content, typically when we're working with forest sourced fiber, that runs between 2 and 4% by dry weight. And when working with urban-based material, think construction, demolition wood, that can be as high as 6 or 7%. Chemical makeup is important. I give examples here of sulfur, potassium, lignin. Certain bioenergy facilities, think power plants, the combustors do not react well to certain alkaloids or potassium buildup that can foul the combustor. So it's important to monitor what the chemical makeup is of the feedstock. Types of feedstocks that are currently utilized, at least with the projects I've been working on, include, of course, forest, and John did an excellent presentation of some of the options out there as far as byproducts from forest operations. This can be fuels reduction, timber harvest residuals, think limbs and tops from commercial operations. They're removing saw logs, and then forest restoration. Unfortunately, in this day and age, at least in California, much of that forest restoration is post-fire. So we're moving a lot of black stems out of the woods in preparation for planting or reforestation. The other component of forest material or forest fiber sources are actual manufacturing facilities, primarily sawmills, generating a variety of byproducts: chips, sawdust bark, green shavings, dry shavings. On the agricultural side, here in California, we're blessed with over 2 million acres of walnut and almond orchards, as well as, of course, citrus and prune and cherries. But these orchards are regularly replaced. So think of a rotation age in those orchards of between 15 years, like with citrus, of all the way up to 28 years at times for almond. And as those orchards are removed and replaced, there's quite a bit of byproduct. And so those orchard removals are an excellent feedstock, primarily for bioenergy. Of course, there's also prunings from those orchards, nutshell. And then in the case of pumice, we're talking about vineyards, and those byproducts are rarely used, but on occasion. On the urban side of things, a very significant driver regarding the urban wood waste and the way it's been developed lately is due to Senate Bill 1383, which requires that organics be diverted away from landfills in California at a very significant diversion rate. And that has incentivized transfer stations, waste haulers, landfills to set up operations to sort wood waste, process it, and then deliver it offsite, divert it away from landfills, for example. So tree trimmings and general wood waste in the form of pallets are a very significant component of that urban waste stream. And then, of course, construction and demolition wood, which seems to ebb and flow with the economy and the investment in either new construction or remodel operations. Remodel of existing homes or apartments. When we're talking about wood waste coming from the urban centers, we are not discussing or attempting to discuss MSW, municipal solid waste. There are incinerators primarily on the East Coast that their focus is on diverting MSW away from landfills and into an incinerator to produce power and steam. Most cases on the East Coast of the US, these are technologies that were developed in Europe and are pretty efficient at what they do. Next slide. Target study area. When we're looking at conducting a feedstock supply availability assessment, we need to set what's the study area, and that's typically based on a radius distance, as you can see here in the slide, 30 to 100, even 125 miles. And we typically set this with input from the client based on our knowledge of the region where feedstock is being sourced, but also a large driver is what is the overall targeted feedstock demand for the facility. If it's a larger facility, let's say 150,000 bone dry tons a year, we would tend to push out towards that 75 or 100 mile radius, or even out to 125 miles. Of course, these target study areas are based on haul times and haul distances. This is an example of a map showing a drive time zone, if you will, or haul time of 60 minutes around a target study area that we set years ago on a project there at Kings Beach, California, on the North Shore of Lake Tahoe. As we drill into cellulosic feedstock availability, we use a couple of filters to set the stage as to ultimately what volumes are available. The first filter is potential estimate, typically tonnage. We prefer to use bone dry tons as the unit of measure. That's a pretty given industry standard here in the West as far as measuring woody material delivered to a power plant or a pulp and paper operation or a panel facility. At any rate, the potential filter we're using here is if the fiber is completely unimpeded by policy or by road systems, what is potentially available. The next step is, okay, now that we have the gross estimate, let's refine it using what's technically or practically available based on road systems, for example, topography, ownership, jurisdiction. Is this a wilderness area? Is this a national park? All of those factor into what's technically or practically available. Then on top of that, the third filter, and this is a very important filter, if you will, because it looks at what's the current demand in the marketplace or competition for this feedstock. We don't want to advocate for competing with existing uses if they're already adding value or societal benefits out there. We don't want to compete with those existing operations. So we have to account for them. And we have to account for potential competition as well. In order to mitigate risk, we have to adjust for what's being considered out there, as long as they're apparently a viable option as far as coming into the marketplace. On top of all this, of course, is community support, stakeholders. You're going into projects like this, we typically work with a communications plan so that we can fill in the community that's being considered for location of the facility, and also sourcing of feedstock. Lastly, the costs to harvest, collect, process, and transport have to be considered, but ultimately what comes out of this is a figure known as what's economically available within that target study area as far as feedstock. When considering current and potential competition, here's some of the examples that we consider when looking at those. Of course, other bioenergy projects, composite panel manufacturing, raw material for soil amendment, mulch, landscape cover, fuel pellet operations, and then, of course, lately advanced biofuels, synthetic diesel, sustainable aviation fuel, renewable natural gas, green hydrogen are all examples. Managing risk, working with our clients, we advocate for a blend of suppliers. Of course, you never want to rely on just a handful of feedstock suppliers. They sometimes cycle in and out of the business. And so to mitigate that risk, we prefer signing up with a number of suppliers, as well as feedstocks. A wide blend of feedstocks is just a good idea, and again, mitigates risk. Also, some of the latest technologies, as far as, for example, biomass power plants, we've seen a series of fluidized bed boilers being installed. One of the key characteristics to those boilers is the ability to take in a wide range of feedstocks, thus mitigating feedstock risk. We also like to have a blend of supply agreements, both short-term and long-term, depending on the risk profile of our client. Some clients prefer to have 50 or 60% of the feedstock under long-term supply agreement, with the balance being short-term. Seasonal availability, this starts to get into decisions being made on the plant site as far as how much feedstock to store and maintain in inventory. Some parts of the West, we have an operating season in the forested landscapes of, say, 7 to 8 months, which means the facility should have the ability to store enough feedstock to get them through 3 to 4 months of downtime in the woods. So seasonal availability is really important to understand that risk. Of course, that can be mitigated if you plan ahead and set forest operations, schedule them such that for the wintertime operations, you're actually able to operate on landscapes that have enough snow cover to allow operations, or hard freeze on the soils allow operations in the winter. So it's just a matter of scheduling your field operations accordingly, trying to optimize and schedule for those winter operations whenever possible. Year-round availability, Of course, I just mentioned the idea of winter operations in the woods and timing and location. We just talked about on-site feedstock storage, but there's also the potential for off-site feedstock storage. In some cases, clients like the idea of collection yards located in strategic wood baskets that allow accumulation of or aggregation of feedstocks all year round, except in the wintertime when those sites can be sourced for that feedstock that's being stored. And this can be strategic in that in the wintertime, anytime trucks are more available, chip trucks, log trucks, because they're wintered out due to snow conditions. And those trucks become available and can move material from that offsite feedstock storage into the facility. Key state and federal policies. I know I mentioned earlier the situation with Senate Bill 1383 driving such a tsunami of urban wood coming out of the urban centers as landfills, transfer stations, and waste haulers divert organics away from those landfills. There's also policies that are driving energy pricing, for example, for bioenergy facilities. And I've got some of these listed here. For example, the BioRAM, which is Bioenergy Renewable Auction Mechanism, BioRAM. And this basically is a power purchase agreement, also known as a PPA, that was mandated by the state such that the CPUC worked with investor-owned utilities. We have 3 of them in California, investor-owned utilities, to issue power purchase agreements that had requirements built in for a certain percentage of the overall feedstock coming in being sourced from forest operations, sustainable forest operations, and also from high hazard zone landscapes as defined by CAL FIRE. There are 7 operating BioRAM power plants today in California, ranging from Weed, California to the north to Sonora to the south. The energy prices offered in those BioRAM PPAs are pretty attractive and cover a pretty significant part of the overall harvest, collection, processing, and transport costs to get wood to the power plants. It doesn't cover all the costs, but it covers much of the costs. Second policy that I have listed here is Biomass. This is the bioenergy market adjusting tariff. This came out of legislation here in California that basically carved out 250 megawatts of the renewable portfolio standard, targeting biomass power plants scaled at 5 megawatts or less. Very interesting program. 50 megawatts of the 250 megawatts carved out, 50 megawatts is set aside for category 3, which is forest operations. So we've been working with a variety of the biomat project development teams, and I think the first biomat facility to come online is at Collins Pine in Chester, and that operation came online, I believe, last year. Also, there's federal funding initiatives out there. I think everyone on the call is probably aware of the bipartisan infrastructure law that is providing significant funding to the National Forest Service, U.S. Forest Service, to support a variety of fuels treatment activities. On top of that, of course, is the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, And there's other legislation out there, of course, like the replant law. All of these have funding that ultimately trickles down to the national forests and Bureau of Land Management districts, helping to support fuels treatment at scale. Later on in this workshop, I think we're going to be hearing from the Office of Planning OPR on their aggregation pilot project. I think Michael will be speaking on that. Office of Planning and Research initiated pilot. Okay, one slide I wanted to include in here is as projects are being developed, there are, from our experience, a certain number of fatal flaws that should be considered up front. First off, as this image shows, don't burn up the excavator. This was an unfortunate incident that we had in one of our fuels treatment equipment trials up in Leavenworth, Washington. Had an issue with the hydraulic hose. At any rate, this eventually got put out and that excavator was rebuilt. As far as fatal flaw issues to consider, though, when developing these bioenergy or value-added product facilities, these 5 issues are really top of mind. Of course, feedstock supply that's economic and sustainable, very key. Community support, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, really need all the stakeholders at the table. And circling back and holding town hall meetings or posting up a website with information, very important. Project economics, of course, if you can't demonstrate a project that's got that's feasible on the economic side, you're not going to be able to secure the funds necessary to implement. So if you're looking at attracting funding from the capital markets, the private capital markets, you're going to need a certain internal rate of return and payback period as benchmarks to secure initial funding and then long-term debt service that long-term debt. Appropriate technology, of course, matched to the airshed or matched to the feedstock that you're hoping to use. Very important. We have seen pretty significant and unfortunate fatal flaws with the selection of the wrong technology, attempting to convert to some value-added products. Just sometimes it doesn't work out. Siting and infrastructure, very important, of course. Need to develop that workforce as well as supply chain. And then permitting, need to be very selective as to where you try to site these facilities based on airsheds or land use zoning, as well as communities that are ready for those commercial scale facilities to be installed and operate. So just to wrap up, key factors to consider when putting together a supply assessment: make sure that we're meeting feedstock specifications based on value-added products. Look at sustainable long-term supply, of course, with close proximity. The number one cost center when sourcing feedstock is transportation. So try to source feedstock whenever possible from as tributary a location as possible. Economically available. Need to account for all of the factors that impact that, including current and potential competition, policies, the cost of diesel fuel, the cost of labor, all those factor in. Within this assessment format or framework, we typically prefer to deliver 5 or 10-year pricing forecasts based on not just base case scenario, but also worst case. Example of worst case could be where additional competing facilities are installed within that wood basket, or diesel fuel increases at some significant scale. Those are factors to consider on that worst case. As far as availability of feedstock, need to, wherever possible, source from a diverse set of suppliers that are financially viable. We like to look at minimum 10-year supply, and some of the private sector investment firms that we work with prefer that 50% to 70% under long-term 10-year agreements, supply agreements. Those same investors also like to have at least a feedstock coverage ratio of 2 to 1, at least 2 times feedstock availability covering what's needed to sustain the facility. That's very important benchmark that has to be met going forward, at least 2 times. Feedstock contracting, we have a series of steps that we prefer to use here at TSS when negotiating with feedstock suppliers. Initially, we like to come to terms with just a general agreement to start discussions, and sometimes the suppliers like to see that memorialized in a memorandum of agreement, MOA or MOU. From that, we can start to put together a term sheet, which results in a letter of intent. This can be a non-binding letter of intent or a binding letter of intent, typically signed by both the seller or the supplier and the buyer or the facility. We have short-term purchase agreement templates that we use, and the short-term is typically defined as 6 to 12 months. Longer term, we have separate templates for that that range from 3 to 10 years. Sometimes that term is set based on certain investment criteria, such as the amortization period or the debt service period that the facility developer is planning to use. Sometimes that's a 8-year amortization period, sometimes it's 10-year, but in an optimized world, we are sometimes asked to match the amortization period with the long-term supply agreement term. These longer-term agreements always have escalation clauses. Suppliers are also risk averse, and they like to see adjustments based on consumer price index that might cover some of the labor costs that go up over time. And then many times the escalation clause will be a blend between CPI and diesel fuel pricing, depending on the supplier. Sometimes suppliers are very dependent on or open to risk on diesel fuel pricing, in which case they might trend more towards the diesel price escalator as opposed to the CPI. And then lastly, these longer term agreements typically have a feedstock price adjustment based on feedstock quality. And I give some examples here of ash content and BTU content. Both of those can be tested as feedstock is delivered to the facility, samples are taken, and then tested for ash and high heat value or BTU content. Okay, we're transitioning now, getting to some of the final slides. As far as a procurement plan, we have a task list timeline that we use working with our clients. And it goes like this. First step, of course, is confirming feedstock specifications based on the technology to be deployed. Secondly, of course, this assumes we've already done the feedstock supply assessment and we have a sense of who the feedstock suppliers are out there. We'll rank those suppliers. Because of the capital markets interest in only those suppliers that are financially viable, we like to rank those suppliers based on financial viability and also on their existing workforce and blend of equipment. Supply chain development, I know I just mentioned workforce. In some cases, we're starting in a greenfield or a region that has very little existing workforce, in which case we might start working with some of the community colleges or the economic development corporations in the area to see what can be done to bring on a workforce that can help with supply chain. Of course, part of the workforce development and supply chain or new supplier development is tied to longer term supply agreements. In other words, if you're hoping to bring new suppliers, feedstock suppliers online, they need to go out and secure financing for the equipment. And many of the financial institutions they're working with want to see a long-term market for the product they're producing. And the way to do that is put together long-term supply agreements that the suppliers can then take to the bank to demonstrate that they've got a ready market for the feedstock, and then they can secure the loans and purchase the equipment. Next is, of course, putting together the supply agreement templates that meet the legal and financial needs of the project developer. We then go out and complete our 5 and 10 year cost forecasts, basically looking at an optimized feedstock blend. In some cases, that's a blend of agricultural feedstocks along with forest feedstocks and urban. We try to come up with an optimized blend, not just to meet the economics, but also to meet the performance of the technology that's deployed, managing risks, looking at the seasonality of the feedstock that's available, taking into account inclement weather. And then lastly, we help our clients recruit the fiber procurement manager position. And the first step, of course, is to define what the job description looks like. And then lastly, for that job description and for that procurement manager, we'll come up with a task list and a timeline for them to consider going forward. An example of a procurement plan can be found on our website at TSS. We have a report section to our website, and you're welcome to look at that. We did a procurement plan in 2015, and that is posted on our website. So with that, I'm open to fielding questions. I know I mentioned my website just a minute ago. Here's the link. So with that, Elizabeth, I'll go back to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tad. I was going to go search for it so I could put it in the chat. I'm glad you had it up there. There's some really great examples that you provide. So yeah, all right. We already have some questions. Don Gasser from the hinterlands way up north here. Hold on. Let me see here. You should be able to unmute, Don.
Yes, thank you very much.
Hi.
Hi, Elizabeth. Hello, Tad. It's always seemed to me if we're trying to increase BTU per pound and reduce moisture content, that we need to be manufacturing it in the woods, starting to dry it there. What are you seeing as the problems with that? What's your sort of advice on that issue now?
Great question, Don. And just for those folks on the call today, I'm pleased to introduce a professor, Don Gasser from UC Berkeley, emeritus, and I will give Don credit. He introduced me to forest management and timber harvesting back in the late 70s. Thank you, Don.
A long time ago.
Excellent question, and I'm happy. I'm pleased to answer any question that you might put up there, Don. As Don makes a very good point, moisture content is a pretty important economic consideration. The facilities that are taking in woody biomass typically are only interested in the fiber, not in the moisture that comes with the fiber. So that explains why pricing is based on a unit of measure known as a bone dry ton. And so basically the suppliers are incentivized to deliver drier material because they're being paid on that bone dry ton. And the way that that is typically done is as fuels are reduced or forests are thinned, the material is left to cure between, say, 60 days and 6 months. I've actually seen it stored in the woods for a year so that it does dry down and then can be chipped and blown into a chip trailer and then delivered. It can also be delivered in roundwood form, which works as well. But the challenges with doing that for the supplier is he's got that inventory of woody biomass stored on site and no revenue. The revenue, the plants typically don't pay for the material until it's delivered. So for the supplier, it's an economic challenge sometimes. Also, of course, the material being stored in the woods, this day and age, there's a potential for wildfire in the West, as we know. And I've seen this happen where material stored in the wood actually, material stored in the forest actually is lost because a wildfire sweeps through and basically reduces it to ash. So those are some of the challenges out there. But ultimately, the supply chain that has developed in California since the 80s, this idea of drying the feedstock before it comes in is really consistent with good practices today, especially on the economic side. I hope that was helpful, Don.
It was. We do have over 600,000 acres that suffered extreme behavior in the Dixie Fire. So we have no problem with inventory out in the woods, and it's going to stay there until we go get it, until the next one takes the rest of it.
Thank you, Don. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Don Turner, you should be able to unmute.
There we go. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Tad, great presentation. Thank you very much. One of the questions I have is I did some work with Moorbark about 6-7 years ago. So I was involved in a lot of the tree processing equipment, spent a lot of time out in the California forest. And one thing I was convinced of is it's really, really difficult to burn green trees. It's that estimated 144 million of dead, down, and diseased trees that are causing all the wildfire problems. At the same time, now I work for a biomass energy company where we make hydrogen via biomass. And our understanding is that the biggest challenge to get the biomass out of California mountainside is that the problem. It's on mountainsides, it's difficult to reach. What is being done, or what do you think is potential solutions to do a better job of getting this biomass out of difficult to reach places? Because it's more expensive to get, but it makes a lot of sense to get it out of there before it starts a wildfire.
Okay. Well, much of California's 33 million acres or so of forest land is roaded. So there is road access to much of that landscape. the part of the challenge, though, with much of the landscapes that are being managed is topography. Steep topography is challenging as far as deploying equipment to harvest and collect that woody biomass, Don, that you mentioned. We are starting to see some creative applications of equipment, typically European equipment. I'm thinking of tethered harvesters and forwarders. We're starting to see in certain parts of the state, also in Oregon and Washington, where equipment is actually tethered at the top of the hill and for safety, and then lower down onto the topography to actually start the harvest with the harvester, and then followed up with a tethered machine called a forwarder to pick it up and bring it back up the hill. So of course, there's traditional cable systems that are also used, yarding systems. Those are expensive to operate. We've seen some smaller units, again, coming out of Europe, thinking of the Kohler yarding system that can be deployed. But you're right, Don, there are some real challenges out there as far as trying to get the wood roadside where it can then be processed and then transported into market.
Okay, thank you very much.
Tad, I was in an interagency conversation yesterday where John McCarthy, you shared a forestry summit that's happening in San Francisco in November. It sounds like it's a really nice opportunity to learn more about some of the technologies, whether in making new products or potentially in some of this harvesting machinery. If you can find the link to that, that might be a nice opportunity for folks to learn more as well. Sounds like it's a collaboration between some businesses in California and the Swedish government, which is kind of fun. All right, our next question comes from Jordan Solomon. Jordan, you should be able to unmute now.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Tad, excellent presentation, fascinating. I appreciate that. I want to maybe address this question to both you, Tad, and also to John, if John's still here, because, and maybe this is just me, but I took away, an implication from some of what you said, John, that there may be some kind of subsidy by whom it's not clear to me, that would deal with the cost of these removals. Tad, as you said, topography can be challenging. Sometimes these removals, haulage costs, skidding costs, there's a whole bunch of reasons why this stuff is going to be expensive. Is it too early to talk? Did I get that right? Is there going to be some kind of subsidy that's going to prevent this, keep this stuff coming out of the forest for the long term at prices that will be attractive to bio-based plants? What's your opinion?
Well, I'll say something quick. It's subsidized now. We're doing a lot of acres. Oh, I want to add also, Don Gasser was my teacher also. Hi, Don. I haven't seen you in decades, but I took the same class from you in the 80s. So good to see you. So it's subsidized now. We've got grant programs that are paying for forest health fuels treatments. There are grant programs with through the federal government. We have a grant program right now for biomass transportation subsidy, a pilot program. The Biomat and BioRam are subsidies. So there are subsidies out there. I think it's going to take more to get to the scale where we want to go, and then it's really about balancing, maybe understanding, well, who's getting the value out of this and who should be paying for it. And there's a lot of work, interesting work on monetizing these kind of some of the values from these products too.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely fascinating. The door is open to further subs, in particular, the transportation subsidy to enable this fiber to be landed at new plants at a price that makes them generate capital that works for their performance. So yeah, thank you for that. Appreciate it.
And Jordan, you're absolutely spot on the transportation side. I'm glad you highlighted that, because of all the cost centers to move woody biomass, at least from our experience, it is the transport side that is the single most costly component. So I'm glad to see the state stepping in on that, John, and I hope that's starting to come together for you.
I will just add to that, Jordan. That's a very timely question, as really all of these are, in that I think probably most of us, at least who are in the investor-owned utilities service areas, have noticed a pretty significant increase in our utility bills in the last 6 months, both electricity and gas. And so the PUC and other associated sibling agencies in the state are very sensitive to anything that would increase the cost of ratepayer bills. So while ratepayers may be the same as taxpayers, that distinction is actually a difference in this case, in that, to John's point, if the benefit of the forest is the forest, it's clean air, it's clean water, if we can pay for some of those benefits in whatever point in the process, whether it's transportation, whether it's electrical bill subsidies, through public funding, that can help California to balance to the economic and environmental values in the state. All right. I think that does it for our questions on Tad's segment. Anything I'm missing, or Tad, any closing comments you'd like to make?
My contact info was on that last slide, but you can also contact me through the TSS website. So if there's any additional questions, feel free to get a hold of me.
Awesome. Thank you, Tad. If you'd like to put your contact information in the chat, that's easy for people to grab. And then we will be making, of course, this recording available to people. And to the extent that our speakers are willing, their slide sets as well. And we will, I think I can grab our attendee list from Zoom, but certainly we'll send it out to our listserv. That's part of the Forest Biofuels program with the Department of Conservation. All right, with that, I am going to move us to procuring biomass from national forests. So when I reached out to Helena, with whom I have had the pleasure of working for the last 6 to 7 months on developing California's wood utilization strategy as part of the wood utilization work group efforts, we have heard many times over those months how hard it is to get wood out of federal lands, how hard it is to finance projects based on federal supplies, and lots of other complaints that maybe aren't great to list here. That being said, there are quite a few people who are making that work. In fact, one project in particular, just recently up in northeastern Shasta County, who secured their last financing because of agreements with the U.S. Forest Service. So it does happen. It is possible. And Helena and Brad are going to tell us all about that. So thank you so much, you two. Pleased to have you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I will attempt to share my screen here. Let me know if it worked.
Not yet.
How about
yes, looks good.
Awesome. All right. So hi, my name is Helena Murray. I know a lot of you on the call, not everybody, so it's nice to meet everyone on here. I manage our biomass and wood utilization program through state and private forestry, which is a branch of the Forest Service.
And then, Helena, sorry, real quick. We can see both your main slide as well as the next slide thing. You know how PowerPoint does that. So I don't know if that's possible to change, but, or if you want to change it.
I do want to.
Okay.
So sorry.
No, it's always a little bit of a struggle out of the computer. does its thing.
Okay. Well, in the meantime, I'll let my colleague Brad introduce himself too. Brad, you're on mute. Forest Service is good at tech.
Yeah, here we go. Yeah, I'm Brad Seaberg. I'm the Region 5 Sale Administration Program Leader and kind of deal with all kinds of timber subcontracting across the National Forest in California.
All right, second time's the charm here. Can you see it now?
Same setup on my side, at least.
Okay. I'm just gonna go with it.
Sure.
All right, so Brad and I will talk to you today about accessing biomass from the National Forests. And first, I'm gonna go into a brief overview of the Forest Service as an organization, our region, and forest management in general. Then I'll pass it off to Brad to go into detail about, we have all of this material and how do you get it to your facility? So the Forest Service and USDA is an equal opportunity provider. I wanted to start with the Forest Service mission, which is to sustain the health, diversity, and productivity of the nation's forest and grasslands to meet the needs of present and future generations. So this mission is what guides everything we do in the agency. And it's a wordy slide, but I just wanted to give you all a snapshot of some things the Forest Service does. We steward and manage over almost 200 million acres of public land in 154 national forests. In addition to that, we have a large research organization that conducts world-class forest research on rangeland forestry and forest resource utilization. We work on partnerships, assistance, and funding support to support non-federal forest conservation and stewardship efforts through the state and private forestry program. We also have an international program helping protect forests around the world. So it's much more than just timber at the Forest Service. So the first thing I want to go into is national forests are guided by laws and policies at the federal level from our representatives elected in Congress. And we have a few different laws that guide management on the national forest. The National Forest Management Act, National Environmental Policy Act, a few others. There's also Forest Service policy, which has been developed to address multiple issues that have happened in the past. And I do want to really emphasize here that since the mid 1900s, national forests have been mandated to be managed for multiple uses. So that's for heritage, archaeology, recreation, water quality, wildlife habitat, forest products, and other things. So we have, our purpose is to manage these lands for the American public and for all of these uses into the future. So laws and policies, we'll talk about how they influence procurement of wood, but they're in place to ensure fair competition, balanced use of our resources, and also public input into forest management so that it's not just one person deciding, oh, we're going to harvest all these trees. There's a whole public input process through NEPA. And so that's the reason for these laws. So into California, where we are today and where both Brad and I work, in Region 5, we have 18 national forests. Here's a map of them. It's almost 20 million acres, so around 60% of the forests in California are national forests. 50% of California's fresh water comes from the national forests. We have more than 600 species of fish and wildlife on these forests. And last year in 2022, just one stat is 434,000 million board feet of forest products were sold in California. So the national forests are managed for multiple uses, as I said. Okay, so a reason why many of us are here today is we do have a wildfire crisis and a forest health crisis brought on by climate change, drought, excessive fuel loading, and we are not blind to this. This is threatening all of the multiple benefits that the national forests provide. So our regional forest management goals, thanks John for the great introduction. We have an agreement with the state of California to contribute towards the 1 million acres strategy. So we're working on that with them very closely. USDA also has a 10-year wildfire crisis strategy that has a lot of the same themes as the state strategy, but it's just nationwide, focused on the West. And with all of that, we have a broader focus on large landscape vegetation management, fuels reduction, partnerships, getting this work done in a way that serves all the benefits of our forests. So, to the real question, how do I procure wood and biomass from the National Forest? I'll start with a brief overview of the process and then hand it over to Brad. So, forest management on the National Forest is not guided by the end use of the product. It's guided by the condition that we want the forest to be in the future. So it starts out with a forest plan that's a guiding document for every forest. Then for any project, it has to go through rigorous surveys, environmental compliance, and public input through the NEPA process. At that point, specialists and experts such as foresters, biologists, archaeologists work to develop the specific project, which can be then put into a contract. So these can be varying sizes, and Brad will go into that. At this point, once we get to row 2, the ownership of the product can be passed from the Forest Service to whoever purchased and successfully received that contract. Contractor does the implementation. They do all of the work outlined in the contract that they agreed to do. If it has product removal, they own that product. They can either sell it to someone else who will remove it and bring it to a facility. The same person can do the implementation, product removal, and be the facility. This can be 3 different people, but once we have this contract signed, then it is on to the contractor. Over to you, Brad.
All right. I guess you're driving the boat, right? Okay. So all forest products removed from the National Forest have to be sold through authorized contracting agreements. And here we have the 4 main ones: the conventional timber sale contract, the kind that we've had since the beginning of the Forest Service in various forms and revisions over the last 100 and something years. During the 1990s, there was started to do pilot projects to see if we could include stewardship projects within timber sales and use the value of the product to offset the stewardship projects, which could be the removal and cutting of small timbers, that doesn't qualify as saw timber. So the integrated resource timber contract was developed, and that contract is similar to a timber sale contract, but it also includes stewardship projects, and the cost of those projects is offsetting, against the timber values. In the number 2 situation here, the value of the timber exceeds the cost of the biomass project. Number 3 is the IRSCs, the integrated resource service contracts. These contracts can all have product of removal as well, but the cost of doing the stewardship project will exceed the value of the product. That's the main difference between those top 3. The stewardship agreement is a newer one, and gaining a lot of momentum in California, where we partner with an entity like the National Forest Foundation or Mule Deer, and they basically set up the contract for logging. May do the NEPA even in some situations. So. But that's another vehicle of how we can have timber products removed. Okay, Elena, we can go to the next one. Oh, okay, that one too. Okay, yeah. So as far as a purchaser of biofuels or small timber, you can bid on a contract, which typically I don't see that done much. I don't see many biomass facilities bid on timber sale contracts directly, although I know of a few exceptions. But normally they work out some kind of deal with the purchaser of the contract to get a certain supply from a national forest to a timber sale or an agreement. Next. Okay, Elena. Oops, yeah, work down. Yeah, a little pause here.
I can try to share it on my screen, Helena, if you're having some issues. All right, I'll go ahead and try to do that. If you want to stop sharing.
Nice. So sorry, everyone.
No, totally fine.
It's okay.
All right. Can you see? I have the PDF version. So
Yeah, well, there we go. That's the next slide, correct? Yep.
all right, just let me know.
All righty. So we got the conventional timber sale contract, and generally this is primarily a saw timber removal contract. However, it can include other products and some limited situations up in the Shasta Trinity, perhaps in historically on the Modoc and Lassen. There in Trow and the Plumas as well. There's been mandatory removal, but you'll see less and less of that because of the cost of removing biomass. So it is typically not mandatory. But in a timber sale contract, the bidding is based on a bid for like a product, a unit. Typically, it can be in tons or it can be in board feet. So that can vary. When I say mandatory biomass removal is not common, but biomass material is included in the contract if someone is willing to remove it, and that's called a timber subject to agreement. And typically, that stuff could be the tops of logs and things of that nature. And if the market develops, we can agree to remove it at some nominal rate that's established in the contract, which is typically about 10 cents a ton. And then here it is, and for a timber sale contract, basically we award it not to the lowest bid. That's for it's the highest bid, right on that one. That's it. I think that's slight a good away with us on that one. But we also to award a contract, also the purchaser has to meet certain capability requirements as well. Okay, the next slide. Okay, the integrated resource timber contract. Okay, that includes saw timber removal typically and service work. So the service or stewardship work is also bid on perhaps a per acre basis or some other unit of measurement. And the saw timber removal part is a bid on the timber value again, like a regular timber saw contract. In the situation of the cost of the work is subsidized by the saw timber value. Very rarely does biomass ever pay its way out of the wood. I don't think it has in a long time. So, and I said, and often you will find that the skidding and decking of small trees that do not qualify as saw timber will be a typical requirement in a IRTC. And we can, well, you might find it, some contracts may include this biomass to be removed as a mandatory item, or it could be subject to agreement where we just skid and deck the lots. And as far as the award of that contract goes, it's based on a best value. So it may not be, the lowest cost or the highest saw timber rate. It's a combination of factors. Okay, next one. Okay, the service contract. In this situation, as we said before, the product of removal and stewardship work will exceed the product value. And so based, you know, you may have a lot of work to do, or it's very costly, or you may have other stewardship projects in that contract, and the product value is bid as well, and as well as the cost of the service. And then this, and just like an IRTC, the award is based on a best value. Okay, next slide. Okay, now we have the stewardship agreements in the Good Neighbor Authority agreements. So a stewardship agreement, you know, allows a partner to complete work on the national forests that have mutual benefit to both parties. So when we talked about the National Forest Foundation, the Mule Deer, the Turkey Federation, all are partners with different forests across Region 5. The Good Neighbor Authority one is typically with state entities. We only have one on the Klamath right now, and that's all we do have. And that one was impacted by a fire last year. So Good Neighbor is not used in California like it is, say, in Idaho or Oregon or some other states. Just for that benefit. And typically on a Good Neighbor Authority agreement, the state runs the contract, and it's their contract, but it's on the national forest. So on the regular stewardship agreements, we have what we call the supplemental project agreements, or SPAs, under a master stewardship agreement. And so the master agreements are typically done at the regional level and signed by the regional forester. The individual SPAs are done on individual forests, and they'll pick out certain acreages or areas where there is some need, and then we enter into an agreement with them. And so this agreement has some similar characteristics to a timber sale contract, except it's governed by different authorities, and a lot of the removal is done by the partner, you know, because they arrange for the contracting and the value, but the Forest Service still maintains oversight of the work and the product of removal itself. So you'll find that stewardship agreements is one place where you will find a lot of biomass, because sometimes the partners have grant funds that they can use that are specifically slated to go toward biomass removal. And also these agreements, just like the IRSCs, will receive appropriated dollars that we've been talking about that may go toward a utilization of biomass and perhaps the transportation in some situations. So and here the partners will typically find the same contractors that we normally have on timber sales, and to do the work of you know, combination of sweat timber removal. It could be aspen of meadow enhancement, small tree thinning, well, you name it, it could be a lot of things. And so that is part of that agreement. And as far as the partner goes, they do conduct a competitive bid process for the contracting and the removal, but it's also, it's based on a best value as well. Oh, very good. Big and bold letters. Yes, the master agreements are not supply contracts, and neither are the, you know, and the SPAs are limited ones too. So there's no volumes or prices or guarantees are provided until specific projects are identified and implemented. So just to clear that up as well. So, okay. In summary, we have the 4 ways of authorizing the removal of timber in forest products. We have the conventional contract, the IRTC, the IRSC, and stewardship agreement. Next slide. Okay, so to get further information on, you know, what each national forest is doing as far as having options for biomass removal, we suggest that you contact the local contracting officer for the national forest or depending on their staffing structure, their timber management officer. There are typically pre-bid tours of the AFRC that conducts reviews of projects ahead of time, and we'll go over how much is saw timber and how much is a biomass product that will be offered typically in the next year. These meetings are done annually, but there's also typically a field tour. And if you're interested, it's worth your while to sign up on bidders list at each forest. And also, as far as being aware of what's happening in the procurement side of things, for IRSCs, it's best to also register in SAM, it's called the System of Award Management, basically where you get your name in there and you can register as a potential bidder, and then you'll find out when certain service contracts are let. So yeah, it's well recommended to establish the relationships with these prospective purchasers and contractors. If you're interested in procuring biomass, they typically will find you as well. The good ones will. And so, but it's best to reach out. That's the typical ones, because you'll find certain ones operate in certain national forests, some operate across several forests, but they all have a handle on what is going on. And last but not least on this is establishing a relationship with our partners. And so the National Forest Foundation is one that has really come along in the last 4 or 5 years since I've been in this region, and they've really started to develop these relationships with local sawmills and biomass facilities around. There you go, Lena. That's your meeting.
Okay, so with that, so we are hosting next week and the week after a few meetings for each Forest Service zone, focusing specifically on biomass that will be available this season and out into the future. This is different from the SAW log program. It is a biomass that are attached to existing contracts or future projects. So if anyone is interested in attending any of these meetings, it will just be a very quick presentation by each forest of the projects that are upcoming. You can send me an email, and my email address is on the next slide. Great. And so please feel free to contact us. Brad mentioned that a great way to get biomass from the National Forest is to contact the local timber sale contracting officer, so we can help connect you with that person. If anyone is interested in grant opportunities for facility development, biomass utilization, and marketing, which was not the topic of this call, but I'd be happy to talk with you about that. So thank you. I see we have one question, at least in this chat from Catherine. I can just read it, and I don't know if Brad, if you want to tackle this, or do you want me to? So it's a question about if we can remove the 10 cents a ton charge for biomass, as it complicates the contractual process.
Yeah, 10 cents a ton is a minimum rate on conventional saw timber products. Stewardship contracts do not have any base rate or a requirement. So theoretically, a biomass or even saw timber values could go to $0 on any given stewardship agreement or contract. So.
Right, and the reason we have specific types of contracts that include product removal is to make sure that product removal is being done in a legal and ethical manner. So if we just have sort of you can take this biomass and there's no appraisal or no, we don't know even what the content of that is, then it's not great. So I think another part of this question is there's limited people who can bid on timber contracts. I believe anybody can put in a bid for a timber sale contract.
Oh, yeah. Anybody can, of course. They have to be deemed as qualified or financially and ethically, you know, suitable for a contract. If they're new, then they would probably have to go through some kind of financial determination. But a lot of our purchasing contractors have been around a long time, have been bidding on stuff, and they range from the mom and pop kind of purchasers to large corporations like Sierra Pacific.
Great. Thank you so much, both of you. I don't want to hear any complaints from anyone on this call about access to Forest Service biomass. This is a really, really fantastic, comprehensive presentation. I do see a couple of questions in the chat, one from Carrie Timmer, who I know is really familiar with the Sierra Nevada. She asked, under an MSA, can carbon credits be generated based on the new reduced emissions from mega fires protocol and sold by the MSA partner to generate funds to put back into the project? Is that you, Brad?
I will start it and I'll let Helena kind of finish it. Unless she wants to take it. Well, the MSA would not, because we don't specify quantities, we wouldn't have anything to quantify tons with, I think. But as far as if they had a regular SPA or something, there may be ways of doing that, but that's beyond my knowledge or what we could authorize for the National Forest at this time.
Yeah, I don't think carbon is considered a forest product under our policies. Yeah. So that question, I think, is, so the reduced emissions from mega fires, I believe that's a voluntary carbon market protocol. And so I would say we do not know the answer to that yet. And policies are being developed at a national level on how to address that type of question.
Yeah.
Thank you. And then Jordan wanted your email, Helena, but Nicole, thank you so much, Nicole, entered that into the chat for folks. Christy Prescott says, we're working on attracting companies that would utilize biomass in creating value-added products, but currently have no demand for biomass. Hence, our fuels contracts do not include product removal. Well, that is something the state would like to start changing, Christy, so I'm glad you're asking this question. Do you have recommendations on how we can gain flexibility in contracting fuels while maintaining opportunity to sell biomass should we have commercial demand? Can you answer that question, or do you need more detail from Christy?
Well, I think the way that the National Forest have typically handled that is they make, if they do generate some quantity of, of logs or small pieces on the landing, we have an option of timber subject to, which was called the timber subject to agreement volume, which we could then agree to remove at some rate, and that should be specified in the contract when they bid. So if it was a penny a ton or 10 cents a ton or 0 a ton, it'd be specified. I looked at a stewardship agreement that's being proposed on the El Dorado, and they had like had minimum rates for saw timber, but they also had like a 0 rate for biomass. So that allowed that kind of flexibility.
That's great. And Christy, if that doesn't answer your question, please raise your hand. Go ahead, Helena. You unmuted, sorry. No, okay. I don't see anyone's hands raised, but I do believe Todd had a question about CAL FIRE working together with the Forest Service, and this might be a good opportunity. Helena, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the regional characterization work that we've been talking about in the wood utilization work group?
Sure, I think I can step a little back from that though, and just say that California and the Forest Service are working together on the Million Acre Strategy. It was a mutual assigned agreement between the two parties. So it's not just California. The Forest Service is actively committed to this, also through the USDA Wildfire Crisis Strategy. So we definitely have the will to work together. And it's been great to have support, especially with funding in the forest health grant programs. They've been able to help with some IRTCs and IRSCs, like Brad mentioned, or stewardship agreements, getting a lot of work done. So being able to share resources, personnel, trainings. I know for our program works very closely with the CAL FIRE Business and Workforce Development Program and with Elizabeth and everybody there. So we have a pretty good synergies. And I think that in order to get this effort to work, everyone does need to work together. So it's a really good question. I'm optimistic about that because I think that we really are in that collaborative mindset region-wide.
Yeah, I totally agree. I come from the water sector where yeah, the agreement on how to manage water in California is like not a thing that seems like it can happen. But forestry, generally speaking, we are all in agreement and facing the same direction. And that includes our elected leaders, policies, financial investments, policy incentives. So while it still feels like things are going slowly, compared with where we were 5 or 10 years ago, we're going much faster. And I think in the next few years, things will really pick up. So that actually is a really nice entree to bringing Michael McGuire on. But before we go there, Helena or Brad, is there anything else you'd like to add, given the questions or anything more?
Brad, you're on mute.
Yeah, I know. Well, there was going to be that one thing that I heard mentioned in Tad's stuff was about how long of our contracts are. So if somebody was planning something with that effect, typically our typical contracts or any of our contracts are like 3 to 6 years. 6 is kind of a long-term one. So 3 to 4 is a typical range. So people wanted to know that.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Brad.
Yep.
All right. If folks didn't get an opportunity to ask a question, please feel free to type it in the chat or the Q&A. We are doing our best to monitor that, or email Helena or Brad, and I'm sure they'll get back to you as soon as they can. Thank you so much, both of you. It's really valuable to get this insight, and yeah, I really appreciate your time. So with that conversation about looking forward and building policies and a foundation for our future here in California and the future of our forests and our forested communities, we are super pleased to bring Michael McGuire in, laid back in his car, just making time for us. So thank you so much, Michael. Nicole, thank you for running the PowerPoint presentation. Just as a quick introduction, we did just want to be sure to include the work that Michael is doing with OPR, because we expect it to be game-changing as far as how feedstock is made available to businesses like yours, making energy, making fuels, and making other biomass products. So I'm really, really pleased with your dedication, Michael. You're making yourself available even in a travel day, and we're pleased to hear your update. So please go for it. Thank you.
Yep, appreciate it, Elizabeth, and thanks for giving me the flexibility to do this on the fly here. Michael McGuire with the California Governor's Office of Planning and Research. I manage the Woody Feedstock Aggregation Pilot Program. And today I'm going to give not necessarily too much of an overview on the pilots. I suspect many of you have heard enough on many of the details, but I will get into how more of the logistics on some of those feedstock supply chain constraints that many of the regions in California face, and how the OPR pilots are really being designed to research various aggregation mechanisms in order to be able to alleviate supply constraints. And of course, how we can make those mechanisms available to the businesses in each of the pilot regions to take advantage of, and ultimately utilize to your advantage to acquire feedstock at a reliable and consistent rate. So with that, let's move on to the next slide. Again, as many of you know, this program was founded out of the Wildfire and Forest Resilience Action Plan, Goal 3, Action 3.10. That additional, or the funding that came out of this was found out of SB 85. So next slide, please. SB 85 really called for OPR to develop 5 pilots to test new mechanisms for developing long-term feedstock contracts. In addition to SB 85, we got an additional appropriation for round 2 of $2 million under AB 179 for the fiscal year 22-23 year. And we anticipate, looks like so far under the May revisions, that we will have a round 3 of an additional $2 million for the fiscal year 23-24. Round 1, which was out of the, which was an amendment to the Budget Act of 2020, really looked at funding each of the 5 pilots to be able to get their initial research activities started. And many of those project resources and deliverables that are being produced are going to guide how each of these pilots will be implemented and how they will operate long term. So a lot of their deliverables are around evaluating potential governance structures, evaluating what local land use authorities can be delegated to special districts in order to operate as feedstock brokers, looking at sustainable financing mechanisms, looking at entity action plans and implementation plans, and preparing those resources in advance of launching the pilots. Round 2 is really about taking those plans and putting them into action. And round 3 will actually be about seed funding each of these special districts as they are created in order to initiate entity operations. So let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. The primary project goal is really about establishing reliable access to woody feedstock. The supply constraints that some of you or many of you have faced over the years is really hampered business growth in this sector and in this industry, and the pilots are really looking at being designed in order to alleviate feedstock supply constraints. You know, as we get more and deeper into the research and the project deliverables from each of those project regions, we can share more about what those aggregation entities and the innovations that each of these pilots will bring to the table. So please do make sure that you get my email address at the end, as if you have any questions, and we can fill you in on what some of those details are shaping out to look like, or if we already do have some clarity, we can share those details with you as well. Again, it really is getting towards improving feedstock supply chains, exploring and assessing market opportunities in each of the project regions, looking at biomass availability, looking at existing infrastructure, looking at workforce, looking at you know, all these pieces that need to be in place in order for a successful biomass industry to be able to operate sustainably in each of the 5 project regions. And of course, the overall goal is to increase feedstock aggregation and make it available to the businesses like you that can use it. Next slide, please. Okay, so what the OPR pilots really are, what they are, the best way to describe them is we are designing them to be feedstock brokers. The goal really is for the pilots to strive to increase security in feedstock contracting by connecting businesses to suppliers and to help them get the long-term contracts that they need. So there's a scale, several scenarios in terms of how aggressive some of these feedstock brokers can operate. Some may be simply just connecting, you know, the private landowners and the owners of the biomass to off-takers and you know, facilitating you know, interactions to be able to off-take that material. Others may be much more aggressive in directly investing in infrastructure, directly investing in services and equipment, and harvesting and procuring and transporting that material from the site to an off-taker. So there are a lot of options between one extreme and the other. We are still in the process of investigating what the appropriate governance structure and entity operations should look like and how we can finance that long term. So as this information becomes available, we will be sure to share it publicly, because ultimately this does not work if we do not build it for the folks who need it, which is you. So of course we're going to need some you know, critical feedback on the feasibility of these approaches and how it can work for you on your end. Moving on, let's see, to the next bullet point. Of course, possible use of, I'm sorry, same slide. Possible use of new contract templates. That is something that we're also currently exploring within each of the pilots, and looking at price controls and indemnity provisions that could potentially be subsidized. Again, still under a variety of research initiatives with each of the 5 pilots. Some of the services that could potentially be offered are contract administration and management through third-party government entities, being the special districts themselves, environmental, business, and landowner support services, insurance products, making insurance products available, or connections to insurance businesses. the pilots are really looking for businesses to begin discussions about feedstock prices and other contract terms. So we certainly invite each of you who are interested and have a business or a site located within each of the 5 pilot regions to reach out to us so we can begin to learn more about each of your projects and how we can begin to design, maybe not necessarily feedstock acquisition plans, but be prepared to provide you with the material that you ultimately would need long term. So next slide, please. These are the 5 regions. We have the Central Sierra pilot project, which is managed by Mariposa County RCD. It includes the counties of Alpine, Amador, Calaveras, Mariposa, and Tuolumne. The next region is in Marin, just to the west. That is a solo project, the Marin Biomass project managed by Marin RCD in Marin County. The largest of our pilots is a 7-county region in the North Coast Resource Partnership managed by Humboldt County. It includes the counties of Del Norte, Humboldt, Mendocino, Modoc, Siskiyou, Sonoma, and Trinity. The 4th pilot is the Northeast California pilot project managed by Fall River RCD, which includes Shasta and parts of Lassen, Modoc, and Siskiyou, some of the national forest lands that runs into some of those counties. And the Tahoe Central Sierra Initiative, which includes the counties of Nevada, El Dorado, and Placer, and that project is managed by the Placer County Water Agency. Next slide. We do have a feedstock aggregation, mapping and aggregation tool that we're building. This tool really is designed to be able to incentivize biomass aggregation through digital infrastructure. The idea is being able to create an online auction mechanism where off-takers can bid on different different pools of biomass, whether it's being pulled from private landowners or elsewhere, and having it geolocated on a map so you could know where it's located, know the condition of the material, and a variety of other variables. I'm not going to jump too much into the details of that, otherwise I could spend the next 30 minutes talking about it. But if you have any questions, again, my email address, I believe Elizabeth has posted in the chat. It is also available at the end of this slide deck. And please do send me an email if you have any questions on how this will operate. We've got a lot of great partners with Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, UC Davis, Cal Poly Humboldt, and product consultants with Amazon Web Services, Scale Capacity Inc., and Spatial Informatics Group. A lot of good things going on. Ideas to create a digital marketplace for biomass so folks can bid on it online. Next slide. Please share your feedstock needs. The whole point of this is institutions and special districts for businesses that need reliable access to forest biomass. We certainly would like to learn more about your projects and how we can design and set up our institutions to be able to meet your needs. So again, if you're interested, please do send me an email. We'd like to send you a questionnaire to learn more about the feedstock quantity, delivery, free species preferences, fuel moisture and condition, and acquisition prices, among other parameters to help to identify and learn more about your project. So again, please do reach out to me, and we're certainly looking forward to hearing from you and setting these things up to help you guys achieve your business goals. I believe that is the end of the slideshow. So next slide for my contact information. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. We do have, and thank you, Nicole, for running through the slideshow. That's super helpful. We do have a question, Michael, in the chat from Susie Petrie, sorry, Susie, if I'm mispronouncing your name. She's asking, does the feedstock and aggregation tool allow for the inclusion of burned wood?
I don't see why we would want to exclude that. We haven't gotten deep in terms of defining, we haven't gotten deep in terms of defining feedstock yet, but that's a good point that we should bring up. We certainly don't want to exclude wildfire salvage. In many respects, that is material that can still be utilized for a variety of different wood utilizations, and we certainly don't want to exclude that. So bringing that up is a good point, and I'll make sure to share that with our software developers that we need to clarify as part of the feedstock preferences, different categories, including wildfire salvage.
Awesome. Thank you, Michael. We do actually have some time for maybe 1 or 2 questions. Also, if you do have a question, please feel free to raise your hand or include it in the chat here. But Michael, there actually was a question in our Q&A that I would love to hear what you all have been talking about on this front. And that's in terms of the wood waste being profiled or sorted by size or condition or type. Is that, because like some businesses are able to use some types of wood, but not others, and certainly different size chips for different applications. Are the OPR pilots considering that kind of diverse need, or are you there yet, I guess?
Yeah, I think we're how aggressive how aggressive some of these pilots will be. Again, there's a scale of just connecting the buyers and sellers, and ultimately, especially on the dashboard, there will be differentiation on, hey, this material is either just fall trees, it's whole logs with X diameter, moisture content, and those kind of variables. It could also include it's chipped or it's shredded or it's wildfire salvage, etc. I think the idea is that some of these may be very aggressive with their intervention and may actually own infrastructure like sort yards to be able to sort the material and have it available in bulk and differentiated, so it's not just all thrown together in a pile. So that if folks want to specifically bid on, let's say, 5 tons of chipped Douglas fir, or 1 ton of small diameter, less than 2 inches thin, from 40% below. They know exactly what they're getting. They know what the prices are, because the prices for the feedstock will vary based upon all these different pieces that we're talking about. Again, looking at the feedstock conditions and of course size, species type, etc. So being able to have that flexibility will help the market be able to differentiate what they want and how much they're willing to pay for it.
Great. Thank you, Michael. That's awesome. And then one last question that I think we're all wondering, and it's a great note to end on, is Susie is wondering if there's a timeline for expanding the OPR pilot program to other regions.
It's a great question. My goal, to put simply, is I would love to do 5 or 6 more of these. There are a lot of regions of the state that are not covered, as you saw on that map. The Central Coast, the Southern Sierras, even that gap between Lassen and Nevada County, where you got Butte and Plumas and Sierra and Yuba. A lot of other regions. Even Southern California. Los Angeles and Ventura, Santa Barbara. So there's a lot of places that we definitely see. Of course, Santa Cruz. I know there's some interest there. There's a lot of opportunity that I would really like to be able to utilize our existing pilots to justify that this theory works, because that's really what the pilots are. It's really kind of an experiment. Do our theories on increasing feedstock aggregation in a cost-effective manner and sustainably, can it work? So I think if we can prove through this trial that these theories do work and are cost-effective and do actually make a measurable impact on the ground, then we can make a strong argument to the legislature and to the governor's office to reauthorize the program for another 3 years beyond this initial 3 rounds, and make investments in other regions throughout the state. Because clearly those, the regions that do have funding are not the only ones with wildfire issues and the only ones that need assistance with feedstock mobilization. So the goal definitely is to get there and do more. But we need to justify that the theory works. And if we can, we certainly will make the argument.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michael. One last comment here from Jordan asking about potentially designating pilot regions as BDO. I think that's bioenergy development opportunity zones could potentially accelerate the project flow. So something to think about and maybe talk about in Martin's group in the next meeting, sounds like.
Sure. Yeah, Jordan, reach out to me. Let's talk, buddy.
That's awesome.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Well, thank you so much, Michael. Really appreciate you making time in your very clearly busy day. And really for all of you to make time to attend today, and to our presenters for participating. You've created a very valuable resource that will live online. I am going to just remind you that the link I just put in the chat is to our Forest Biofuels Program webpage. There is a listserv there that we use often to alert folks to grant opportunities that maybe aren't ours, but are some of our sibling agencies, workshops. There's a grant writing workshop coming up that we recently released an announcement to. And then we will also, of course, announce the availability of this recording and other associated materials when it is available there. And again, I'll do my best to do it via Zoom, but sometimes Zoom doesn't cooperate. So we'll do what we can. Thank you so much for being here today, and enjoy your afternoon, everyone. Bye-bye.